Hello, Pete the Wargamer here, and this time I'm back with another Warhammer 40k painting tutorial. This time I'll be guiding you through the process of painting a Locus of the Genestealer Cult, and as usual I'll be using the Citadel range of paints to do so. Before we can begin painting, we first of all need to prime. I've used a black surface primer through an airbrush for this, due to the large amount of dark colours present on the miniature. I've also only partly assembled the miniature and have kept a number of these items separate to make painting those tricky areas much easier. This was achieved very simply by drilling a small hole with a pin vise and using a small bit of superglue to attach a length of 1mm wire. We can start things off by painting on the base coat, but before you do, you want to thin down your paint. This is a process that will be repeated throughout all the base coats in this video, so take your paint and mix it with a little water. Add some water in small amounts until your paint has a consistency similar to what you see here. The first paint for the base coat is Naggaroth Night, and this will be applied over the cloak of the Locus. This paint will act as an excellent starting colour for the darker areas of the deep purple fabric, as well as allowing us to more easily paint on the lighter purples in later steps. Next, we'll be painting the protruding spine and tail poking out from beneath the robes, using some Kantor Blue. This dark blue is perfect for starting off the carapace colour of the Cult of the Four-Armed Emperor. For the dirty grey armour found across the shoulders and chest, we'll be first applying a base coat of Celestra Grey. This light grey colouring will dull down nicely when we come to apply our washes later on. Next up, we're going to be putting down the base colour for some basic non-metallic metal effects on the hem of the robe. To start things off, we want to create the darkest colour of the gold effect by using some Mournfang Brown as a base coat. You can also use this paint to paint the brown leather holding the swords to the Locus's back as well. For the red areas of the miniature, which include the sword handles, cabling on the armour, and also the handle of the cane, we'll be applying a base coat of Mephiston Red over them. You can also use this paint to add a stripe to the right shoulder pad. Start by painting two thin red lines onto the shoulder pads to mark out the boundaries before filling in the area. You can then use some Celestra Grey to add some scuffs and paint chips to the red as well. Next up, we want to tackle the pallid skin tone of the Locus as well as the strips of parchment pinned to his robe. For both of these areas, we'll be starting off by applying a base coat of Rakarth Flesh. For the small, scorpion-like spike at the end of the protruding tail, the fabric around the middle of the blades as well as the Locus's fingernails, apply a base coat of Dark Reaper. This dark grey blue will contrast nicely against the richer blue of the carapace. For the neck of the Locus as well as his blade sheaths, apply a base coat of Abaddon Black. It may seem odd applying black paint over black primer, but black paints can have subtle differences, so it's good to keep things consistent. Additionally, it also gives you the opportunity to clean up any mistakes you might have made. The last two areas to base coat are the metallics. We'll be starting off with the dark silver of Leadbelcher to paint the various areas of bare steel across the miniature. These include the pole and parts of the cane. Metallic paints can be much more difficult to cover over if you do spill, so make sure you take your time with these particular steps. The final base coat to apply is one of Balthasar Gold. We'll be using this on all of the remaining areas of the miniature, which include any cult symbols and the hoops of the blade handles. Once you've completed this step, make sure that you thoroughly clean out your brushes and paint water as you do not want to cross-contaminate the metal flakes found in these last two paints into your other non-metallic paints. With our base coats completed, we can now begin working on achieving some gradients in the robes. For these steps, we will need to create some mixtures using Lahmian Medium. Start by creating a mixture of 3 parts Lahmian Medium to 1 part paint. This medium is basically a pigmentless paint that will allow us to create translucent paints. For our first gradient, I've started with Xereus Purple and will be using it to pick out the raised edges and folds of the robes. Apply the mixture to these raised areas, leaving the darker Naggaroth Night visible in the deeper recesses. Allow the first layer to dry and then apply a second layer over the top. However, slightly reduce the area that you're covering this time. Repeat the step again to create a smooth transition between the darker and lighter purples. Focus this application towards the upper parts of the miniature so that the shoulders and hood appear lighter than the bottom of the cloak. The next Lahmian Medium mixture to apply is to the skin. To further enhance the pallid nature of the skin, we'll be mixing together Lahmian Medium and Deepkin Flesh in the same 3:1 ratio as before. Apply your mixture to the more prominent facial features such as the forehead, nose, cheeks and fingers, leaving the darker Rakarth flesh only visible in the recesses. After the first coat had dried, apply a second layer, but instead only focus on the harshest facial features like the ridges of the forehead, nose, brow, cheeks and mouth. This layering technique combined with the Lahmian Medium thinning will help to create a smoother and much more realistic looking transition between the darker and lighter skin tones that we have here. Before we move on to the washes, we next want to work a little on our non-metallic metal trim of the robe. Thin some Balor Brown with Lahmian Medium like in the last steps, and use this to first paint the harsh edge of the hem before carefully picking out a couple of the square segments towards the middle of the body, on top of the wrist, and at the very bottom of the robe where it starts to flick out. Like before, we want to achieve a transition between the lighter and darker areas, so apply your first layer, allow it to dry, and then apply your next over the top, covering a slightly smaller area than previously. Building up these layers will help to create the appearance of reflection in the material, giving it a slightly metallic appearance. With our gradients completed, we can begin applying some washes. However, some will need to be more subtle than others. For these, mix in some Lahmian Medium once more. This time I would suggest a mixture of 1 part wash to 2 parts Lahmian Medium. This will reduce its strength slightly and prevent it from being too overpowering. The first wash to use in this way is Nuln Oil, and this will be applied over the robes. Focus your washes into the recesses rather than painting over the whole robe. The intention here is to darken the deeper recesses, further enhancing our transitions. For the tail, carapace and silver areas of the miniature, apply a wash straight from the pot over the whole area, bringing out details in these parts as well as dulling down their brightness a little. Following the same thinning method as before, apply some Agrax Earthshade over the grey armour. Again, focus this mainly into the recesses to both help the shading, but also to create the appearance of a slightly dirty, scavenged armour. You can then use this wash over the brown, red and bronze areas of the miniature as well. At the moment, our locus is looking almost white, so we need to bring down the brightness a bit. This can be achieved by an all-over wash of Lahmian Medium thinned Reikland Fleshshade. Our final wash will involve using some Carroburg Crimson and Lahmian Medium to apply a reddish hue to the locus's head. Start at the base of the skull and build the wash up over the back of the head. Allow the first layer to dry and apply a second, but don't quite cover as large an area as you did previously. You can also apply a small amount of this wash over any scars on the model and around the eyes to help enhance these details. As an optional detail, you can apply some thin veins at the back of the head using some Xerous Purple. Mix in a little water to improve the flow of your paint and use a fine brush to draw on some branching lines. Start at the neck and work your way over the back of the head. The next set of steps involve applying some edge highlights. For the first of these, we'll be using some Warpfiend Grey to pick out the upper edges of the robes. To edge highlight, use a small brush with only a little paint and carefully drag your brush along the most prominent edges where the light falls. These will usually be along the most upper edges. This will result in a thin, lighter coloured line that creates the effect of light hitting the surface. This will help to make those details stand out, but also improve the level of realism. After applying a highlight, you can further enhance details by applying an extreme highlight. This is much like a regular highlight, but you only focus your paint onto focus points such as the sharp corners on the edges you've already highlighted. The first of these will be of Slaanesh Grey, and I'll be targeting the most prominent parts of the locus's robes. You can also easily create the effect of wear and tear on the bottom of the robes with some fine vertical and diagonal lines. Paint these from the head, moving your brush upwards. For the blue carapace and tail, apply a fine edge highlight of Sotek Green. Following on from our edge highlights, you can then pick out some of the upper corners of the sections of the carapace and the tail with some small dots of Temple Guard Blue. Next, we can finish off the grey armour by picking out the edges using some Ulthuan Grey. To bring out the details in the brown leather holding the scabbards together, you can use some Skrag Brown. You can also give the leather a slightly weathered appearance by adding some fine lines, much like we did with the bottom hem of the robes. Next, I'll be picking out the red of the sword handles and piping of the armour with some Evil Sunz Scarlet. For the fingernails and the spike at the end of the tail, you can line the top edges using Thunderhawk Blue. After the washes over the skin, you may find that some of the facial details have become a little muted. You can help to bring these out again by using a little more Deepkin Flesh and focusing your highlights on the most prominent facial features, such as the scars on this particular head. For the top edges of the black sheaths, apply a fine line of Skavenblight Dinge. Using Stormvermin Fur, follow the same steps as our earlier extreme highlights and also the scratches in the robes to create a worn, cracked leather effect on the sword's sheaths. The last non-metallic areas left to highlight are the strips of parchment pinned to the robes and also the gold trim of the robe itself, the edges of which can both be painted with a thin line of Ushabti Bone. To add some text to the parchment, use a thin brush and some slightly thinned Abaddon Black. Run your brush horizontally across the strips, adding in some random movements and breaks to create the effect of text. If you have a steady hand, you can also use this paint to black out the eyes of the Locus, giving him a sinister and alien appearance. Alternatively, adding small dots of Ulthuan Grey to either side of the eye after the Abaddon Black will create a more human looking eye. For the bronze coloured areas, apply a thin line of Gehennas Gold along the edges. Be very careful, as at this stage it can be tricky to resolve overspills of metallic paints. The final edge highlight to apply is Stormhost Silver, and this will be applied to all of the remaining silver parts of the miniature. This thin, bright silver line will give the effect that the metal is reflecting light of its most prominent parts. And here we have the completed Genestealer Cult Locus. I finished things off by varnishing and assembling the components before creating a simple basing scheme using textured paints. You can find a full list of all the paints that I've used in this tutorial in the description below, along with any equipment that I've used to create this video, such as my everlasting wet palette. If you enjoyed this video, do let me know in the comments below, and if you haven't done so already, be sure to check out my Patreon page if you would like to support me in making these videos. If you have any questions or just like to chat with others who enjoy my channel, I've also set up a Discord server which you can find a link to in the description below. And so the only thing left to say is, thanks for watching and goodbye.